This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. Say it with me now. Red and green and brown and blue. They're the really useful crew. The island of Sodor's Northwestern Railway is unique in that it doesn't have a uniform livery. Its engines are all different from each other. Well, for the most part. All with their own unique designs, colors, lining, and patterns. Each engine's unique livery is important to their identity. Their distinct designs help us, the audience, tell who each character is immediately. There's never any question whether that's Gordon or Henry in the background. This is the case in real life too. Engine liveries have a reason for them. They are essentially a uniform that the engines wear. They're representative of the company's brand colors. They mark which railway an engine belongs to. Or they're designed in a way specifically to dazzle and impress. Or sometimes they're meant to represent an event or an anniversary. And while many might look at the Thomas characters and think, well, they look that way to sell toys, it may surprise you that a lot of these liveries are inspired by ones in real life. Most of Thomas's expansive cast have backstories, lives that they lived on other railways before coming to Sodor. And I thought today it'd be fun to go through the livery history of the whole cast. What colors exactly did Thomas, Gordon, Duck, Spencer, and all the others all wear before coming to Sodor? Now, a full disclaimer here. There is no way I can cover every character's livery history in this video. There are over 300 engines in this series, and I don't exactly have the patience to edit a 6-hour video. So I'm going to have to pick and choose a bit here. If certain characters have only ever worn a single livery their whole life, then I think we can safely trim those ones out of this, because there's not much to talk about there. And admittedly, a lot of the TV characters are just in random colors for the sake of toys, so we can probably trim most of those ones out too. But some of them actually have rather inspired livery choices, or have connections to real-life locos, whether that be their livery, their number, their backstory, etc. And those ones I would like to talk about. Basically, if I feel there's a story there worthy of being discussed, or if they actually received a permanent livery change, they'll be covered in this video. So don't be offended if your favorite character wasn't covered here. I promise you, it's nothing personal. My research on some of these is limited by what's available online, so by all means, if you know a little more about other liveries these characters may have worn from your own research from books or elsewhere, please comment them. I learn a lot just from all of your comments on my videos. The more we collectively all know, the better. I think the best way to go about this is to just go in order of appearance. So we'll start with the first characters in the books and work our way up to modern day. Let's kick this thing off with the first character of the series, Edward. Edward is a, well now heavily modified, K2 class tender engine from the Furness Railway. First built in 1896, Edward would have worn the Furness's Indian red livery with FR on his tender sides. He likely would have still been in these colors when he first arrived on Sodor in 1914 to help build the railway, though we never saw that. Albert, another engine from the Furness that we learn about later on, also wore this same livery. In real life, there are two engines that still wear the Furness colors, and that is Copper Knob, on display at the National Railway Museum in York, and number 20, currently in operation at the Ribble Steam Railway. Upon being purchased for the Northwestern Railway in 1921, Edward was repainted in the Northwestern's standard blue livery with red lining and gold accents. Northwestern blue, for a time, was the uniform livery across most of the Northwestern's fleet. Gordon and Thomas both wear it, Donald and Douglas wear it in the books, Henry wore it for a short time, and even James once sported it in a fantasy sequence.
I'm blue! Oh no!
It's interesting to note that the livery, as it is now, differs from its original conception. In the original illustrations for the 3 railway engines by William Middleton, the blue was much darker, and the red lining was non-existent. Instead, the boiler bands were gold, and the lining on the splashers, cab, etc. was black. The gold is also visible in Audrey's original drawings of the characters. It appears he changed his mind on the colors pretty quickly though, because by the very next book, Thomas the Tank Engine, all the engines sported red lining instead of gold and black. As far as I know, the standard blue livery was not based on anything in particular, but it does strike a slight resemblance to the Caledonian Railway's lighter blue livery. That's probably the closest that you'll find to the Northwestern's blue, at least in the UK. Gordon. Moving on to Gordon now. Gordon is an A1 Pacific from the Great Northern Railway, and as the Island of Sodor book tells us, he was the first one built. He was the class's prototype, first built in 1921 or so, and never entered revenue-earning traffic, nor received a number. While he never entered traffic, he was still painted in the Great Northern's apple green livery. As he recalled in Gordon Goes Foreign, he was once painted green.
"When I was young and green," he said, "I remember going to London. Do you know the place?"
This is a clever line, because it has a double meaning. He means young and green, as in inexperienced, but also green, literally. As he never entered regular service, the extent of the livery's detail is unclear. In 1923, he was auctioned off to the highest bidder, who was Sir Topham Hatt. Upon his arrival to the Northwestern Railway, Gordon was repainted in the company's standard blue with red lining, and he has worn these colors ever since. Henry. Henry is an oddball. We all know his story. He was based on discarded designs drawn up by Sir Nigel Gresley and built in secret by an unknown builder before being offloaded on Sir Topham Hatt in 1922. Prior to Sodor, we don't really know what Henry's livery would have been. It's never been noted. He was based on Great Northern designs, but as he never ran under the Great Northern, he never would have worn their colors. Presumably, Henry may have simply worn a works gray, or possibly even a plain black. It's also very much possible that Henry was painted in his green with red stripes by his previous owners, and Sir Topham simply never changed it after acquiring him. Hence why he was the only green engine among a fleet of blue and red in the first book. Regardless, when Henry came into Northwestern ownership, he was painted in what became the railway's standard green with red lining. Percy also wears this livery, as did James once in a fantasy sequence. For a short time, starting in 1923, Henry wore the railway's standard blue, during a brief period where all the Northwestern-owned engines were uniform. This changed fairly quickly though, as all passengers, aka the readers, could not tell him and Gordon apart. So, around 1926 or so, he was repainted back into green, and he has worn this livery ever since, even after being rebuilt at Crewe. I don't believe the green livery is based on anything specific in real life either, but green was a very common color for steam engines. Several companies used variations of green, including the Great Northern, the Northeastern, the Southeastern and Chatham, the London and Southwestern, the Great Western. The list really is endless. The reason why so many railways used green as their main livery color was simply because it was an easy color to produce. Many railways' works produced their own paint using natural ingredients, and green was the easiest to create. Darker shades of green also withstood hot temperatures well and did not fade easily. So, green ended up being a pretty common color on railway engines. I always had this headcanon that the railway's two colors designated the type of work that the engine did. The standard blue designated passenger services, hence why Edward, Gordon, and Thomas all wear it. And the standard green designates mixed traffic, hence Henry and Percy. If James wasn't given his special red, I imagine he would also have received green at some point. Topham did threaten to paint him blue once.
"If you can't behave, I shall take away your red coat and have you painted blue."
But remember, this exchange occurred during that brief period where everyone wore blue, including Henry. And by the time that Duck arrived in the mid-50s, Charles Hatt was in charge and allowed the engines to all be in the colors that they chose to wear. That, of course, is just my own headcanon, though. Thomas. Thomas is an E2 class tank engine. and was built in Brighton in 1915 for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. He didn't see much time in the South though, as he was sent north during the war that same year, and found his way onto Sodor Metals. Thomas's original livery is never noted in any lore material, but if we were to make an educated guess, he more than likely would have been painted in the LBSC's black livery with red lining, complete with LBSC on his side tanks and number on his bunker, as all the E2s wore at this time. In real life, the E2s wore several liveries over their working lives. 2 were painted in the railway's umber brown briefly. After the 1923 grouping, they would have worn Southern black, and finally British Railways black after nationalization. But as Thomas went to Sodor early on in his life, he never wore any of these. The TV series depicts Thomas's LBSC livery quite differently. In The Adventure Begins, Thomas arrives on Sodor wearing a teal green with white lining, with LBSC painted on his side tanks. Why he's green here instead of black isn't really clear, but it's probably for a couple reasons. 1, because a toy of a green Thomas is much more appealing than a black one, and 2, it may be a reference to the livery that Audrey's original model of Thomas was painted in, which was painted in a teal color, albeit with yellow lining instead of white. I really hope that the latter is the case, because it makes this Thomas a blend of origins, referencing the original Thomas model, and keeping his LBSC history intact. Either way, in both canons, once Thomas came into Northwestern ownership, he was painted in the railway's standard blue, with his token number 1 painted on his sides. And he has proudly worn these colors ever since.
Blue is the only colour for a really useful engine. Everyone knows that.
James. James is an experimental version of the Class 28 tender locomotive from the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, first built in 1912 or so. As a mixed traffic engine, James would have worn the railway's black livery with red lining, complete with Lancashire and Yorkshire on his tender. The Lancashire and Yorkshire was absorbed into the London, Midland and Scottish Railway in 1923, and for a very short time, James would have been owned by the LMS. His livery would not have changed much, and it's never been noted if he actually was repainted during this time, though if he was, he would have gained LMS on his tender. Regardless, James's life with the LMS did not last long, for he was sold to the Northwestern Railway only a year or so later. He wasn't repainted immediately, and was still in black in his first appearance. The TV series sticks to this backstory, as depicted in The Adventure Begins. He wore black with red lining, though he had the number 5 painted on his tender. James suffered a bad accident not long after arriving. The accident wasn't his fault though, and to cheer him up, Sir Topham Hatt allowed James to be painted in a special livery while at the works. A bright scarlet red with gold boiler bands, dark blue lining, and exposed brass. Again, there is no historical basis for this livery design, but it does bear a striking resemblance to the Skarloey Railway's main livery, and I've theorized before that there may be a connection there. In the TV series, James's red livery is very similar to the books, with some ever so slight differences. His dark blue lining is instead black, as is his cab roof. James has probably had the most livery variants of any character in the TV series. We've seen him sport an exposed pink undercoat before. He once got a yellow and black B livery. We saw him in the Northwestern's blue and green. We've seen him in silver, all sorts of colors. But I think we can all agree, his splendid red suits him best.
Wow, James, you look splendid.
I know.
Percy. We have absolutely no idea where Percy served before coming to Sodor, nor when he was built, so the livery he wore prior is totally up to your own interpretation. He was built by the Avonside Engine Company, we know that much, but that doesn't really confirm anything in terms of a livery. We do know that Percy has always been green though, as he confirms in Thomas Percy and the Coal.
I've always been green. I wouldn't want to be any other colour either, added Percy.
More than likely, Percy went straight into industrial use after being built, and had a green paint job that matched the colours of the company that he worked for. What company that was is up to your interpretation. After Percy eventually found his way to Sodor, he was repainted in the Northwestern's standard green livery, the same as Henry. And that's pretty much all we know for him. Not too much else to say here. Toby. Toby is the first engine of the video, and the franchise, that is meant to be a real engine that existed. Great Eastern Railway Class C53 tram locomotive number 127. And so, we can assume all of the real locomotive's history applies to Toby. First built in 1914, Toby would have worn the Great Eastern's ultramarine blue livery with red lining. The wood of the C-53's bodies were painted in the railway's coach brown to match its carriages, while the metal of the side plates got blue. Around 1919, he would have received a repaint, this time with the wood being painted a crimson brown and side plates in a much lighter gray color. After grouping in 1923, Toby was repainted again in the much simpler LNER black. The shade of brown on his wood changed again, and his side plates were painted in solid black with LNER lettering on them. We actually saw Toby wearing this livery in a flashback during Toby, Trucks and Trouble, when he reminisced on his time back in East Anglia. Following nationalization in 1948, Toby was repainted again. He was put in British Railways black livery, essentially the same as before, but now with British Railways printed on his side plates. Later on, this would be replaced with BR's early crust, and he only wore this for a few years. By the time we first met Toby in 1951, his livery had faded. His black side plates were now gray, and his BR crest presumably hidden under years and soot of grime. After his line closed down, Toby found a second life on Sodor, and eventually was given a new livery to suit his new life. The new livery is reminiscent of his original Great Eastern colors, with a new lighter chocolate brown, complete with light brown trim, and side plates in a solid dark blue. I have always loved this look for Toby, and I wish it translated over to the TV series. In the TV series, Toby's livery never changed after he came to the Northwestern. He essentially wears his BR colors throughout the whole show, though his side plates were built in gray, likely because they were based on how they looked in the book illustrations, where they were meant to be faded and grime-covered. Skarloey and Rheneas. We'll cover these two together, as their histories are pretty much the same. Skarloey and Rheneas are the oldest working engines on Sodor. These two narrow-gauge engines were both built by Fletcher Jennings and Company in 1864 and 1865 respectively. Each are essentially carbon copies of Tallyclyn and Dalgach, the two engines that worked on the Tallyclyn Railway in Wales, and were built alongside them. Upon their arrival to Sodor, both engines were painted in the Skarloey Railway's red livery. This consisted of a scarlet red with blue lining and exposed brass, very similar to James's. And, for the most part, they've worn these colors their whole lives, and still do today. In Four Little Engines, the engines are depicted in more of a pinkish red, rather than a scarlet red. I've always interpreted the pink here as their red being faded, as the two are old and worn out at this point in the series. This, of course, was probably not the intention, as Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel are also depicted in it. The TV series tried to differentiate the narrow-gauge engines by giving each a different color. Skarloey, being the main one, retained the red, though with his lining changed from blue to white. Rheneas, however, became more of a red-orange with gold lining. Funnily though, despite the change, Rheneas was often depicted in a pink sort of carmine in most of his merchandise prior to 2012. I speculate this may have been done for one of two reasons. It's pulled from the Four Little Engines illustrations, where he was depicted in a sort of pink, or it was to differentiate him even more from Rusty, who was also orange. But I don't think an actual reason has ever been given. Rheneas' prop has worn green before, when it was used to depict Smudger for his scenes in Grandpuff. He also very briefly took on a yellow livery with blue lining, for a gag in the post-credits scene of Blue Mountain Mystery.
Thomas, meet the Yellow Engine.
Ta-da!
Rheneas!
It's me!
The real Skarloey and Rheneas, Taliclin and Dalgach, have both worn several colors over the years. Like Skarloey, Taliclin has worn red, and also the Taliclin standard green, once a take on BR Black, and is currently sporting a guise inspired by Great Eastern blue. Dalgach has also worn red and multiple shades of green. Sir Handel. Sir Handel is an arrogant and easily set-off narrow-gauge engine. He was built in 1904 for the Mid-Sodor Railway, and was then named Falcon, after his builder. He was based on the design used for the saddle tank locomotives designed for the Corus Railway in Wales. These little engines wore crimson red, though as Sir Handel never went to the Corus, he never received those colors. Sir Handel was first painted in the Mid-Sodor's royal blue livery, complete with black lining. He retained this livery until the railway closed in 1947. Following its closure, he and Stewart were sent to the island's aluminum works to help with an expansion project, though we know very little of the colors they would have worn then. It's basically up to your own interpretation. They eventually found a new home on the Skarloey Railway, and there the two were repainted into the railway's red livery. Falcon's new name, Sir Handel, was painted onto his tank sides. The two gained buffers, and some other cosmetic changes in the years following their arrival. In the TV series, Sir Handel retains his blue livery from the Mid-Sodor Railway, and has worn that color throughout the show. The livery differs slightly though, having red lining instead of black. Sir Handel's real-life inspiration and namesake, Sir Hayden, has worn several liveries over the course of its life. It wore the Corus Railway's red during its Corus days, and in preservation, Taliclin green, a special Sir Handel-inspired red, and even once, a rather head-turning yellow, definitely one of its more peculiar looks. Peter Sam. Finishing off the four little engines is Peter Sam. Peter Sam was built in 1920 by Kerr Stewart and Company for the Mid-Sodor Railway. Upon arrival, he was named Stewart, after his builder, and painted in the Mid-Sodor's green livery with black lining. Like Sir Handel, he went off to the aluminum works following the Mid-Sodor's closure, and the livery he wore then is up to your interpretation. In 1952, he joined the Skarloey Railway, where he was named Peter Sam, and was painted in the railway's red livery, with his name painted on his saddle tanks. Peter Sam gained buffers then, and some other design changes over the years. Some years later, his original chimney was knocked off by an icicle, and it was replaced with a Giesel ejector. He has remained in this condition ever since. Just like Sir Handel, in the TV series, Peter Sam retained his Mid-Sodor colors upon arrival to the Skarloey Railway. The livery again differed slightly from the books, with red lining instead of black. With the exception of his chimney change, Peter Sam has more or less remained in this look till the end of the show. Peter Sam's real-life inspiration, Edward Thomas, has worn a number of liveries in its life. Like Sir Hayden, Edward Thomas first worked on the Corus Railway and wore the Corus Red. It's also worn the Taliclin's green many times, a Peter Sam-inspired red, Great Western Brunswick, this being in reference to the Corus's absorption into Great Western ownership in 1929, British Railways Black. This is probably my personal favorite, the little 4-number plate on his smokebox kills me, and its current livery, Kerr Stewart Works Grey, in reference to its builder. Duck. Duck is a 5700 class pannier tank from the Great Western Railway. He was first built in 1929 and served most of his working life as a station pilot at Paddington before making his way to Sodor in the mid-50s. The Great Western Railway Company has been around since the 1800s and naturally went through several livery changes over the years. We don't know what liveries Duck wore for sure, but we can speculate based on what we know about the Great Western's livery history. As Duck was built in 1929, he would have likely been outshopped from Swindon wearing the unlined Brunswick green, with the full Great Western lettering on his tanks. Starting in 1934, several engines were repainted into a simpler livery. The Great Western lettering was removed and replaced with the more minimalistic shirt button emblem. Many engines never got this version of the livery, but for the sake of this video, let's assume that Duck received it during a repaint during this time. The shirt button was short-lived though. Starting in 1942, it was retired, and all engines left the works in the new GWR paint job. In Duck's case, unlined green with GWR on his tanks. We know that Duck definitely received this, as he returned to it once he reached Sodor. After the formation of British Railways, most of the panniers received unlined black starting in 1949 or so. Duck would have been painted solid black with BR's early crest on his tanks. Around 1956 or so, panniers started to receive additional lining, but as Duck went to Sodor in 1955, it's probably safe to assume that he never got lining. The Island of Sodor book states that Duck arrived on Sodor in BR black, and Charles Hack graciously allowed him to return to his previous GWR colors. He still wears this version of the livery today, and is quite proud of his roots. In the TV series, Duck has always been painted in his GWR livery, though his shade of green is much brighter than it would have been in real life, and his 5741 number plate was replaced with an 8. City of Truro. City of Truro broke history in 1904 when it allegedly became the first engine to go 100 miles per hour. The record is debated, but nonetheless, he is famous for it. Truro is by no means a major character in this series, but as one of the few real engines to make an appearance, I think he's worthy of a mention in this video. First built in 1903, City of Truro would have been painted during the Great Western Railway's monogram era, in a beautifully ornate lined Brunswick green with Indian red frames, and the Great Western's monogram on his tender. This is his most known look, and it's what he wore when he broke the speed record. By 1912, Truro had taken on a livery change, this time to a less ornate livery, still Brunswick with orange lining, but with the Indian red frames now black, and the Great Western's monogram replaced with the full Great Western lettering on his tender. His number was also changed from 3440 to 3717. City of Truro was retired from service in this condition in 1931. Since preservation, Truro has gone between his two liveries. He returned to his original look when he was brought back to steam in 1957, and this is the condition that he was in when he visited Sodor, in the books and in the TV series. In present day, Truro is currently in his 3717 guise. These weren't the only colors that Truro has ever worn though. In 1984, Truro was sent to the Severn Valley Railway for overhaul, and as an April Fool's gag, the railway painted one side of Truro in BR black, just to get a rise out of people. The joke didn't go down too well though, but fortunately by the time the photos of Truro were publicized, he had already been stripped and returned to his Great Western colors. All that time and effort just to pull a prank on train fans. You gotta respect that hustle. Diesel. Diesel is, well, a diesel. A British Railways Class 08 diesel shunter. As the most mass-produced engine class ever in Britain, these engines are a very common sight around the UK's railway systems, and still are today. Diesel was built in 1956, only a couple years after the class was introduced. At this time, all the Class 08s were painted in solid BR black, black all over with red side rods, and BR's early crest on their sides. This is more or less the condition that Diesel was in when he had his trial on Sodor in 1957. He didn't sport the BR crest in the illustrations though, and I'm not entirely sure if the lack of one is truly considered canon. He also has unpainted silver side rods, which is an exclusive trait of the 08s that were built in Darlington. I've shouted out Sodor Island models several times in my videos, and I'm shouting him out again for all the research that he's done on Diesel. He tracked down his BR number, which is now believed to be 13236. If you haven't watched his series of Diesel videos already, go check them out, they're linked below. They are quite fascinating, and most of the info here is pulled straight from them. For the sake of this video, we will assume that Diesel is 13236, to find out what other liveries that he wore after his stint on Sodor. At some point prior to 1967, Diesel went in for overhaul and came out of the works repainted in BR green with the lake crest, and with yellow and black wasp stripes on his front and cab rear. He had been renumbered to D3236. Following 1967, Diesel's next repaint would have seen him repainted in BR's rail blue livery, with the new Double Arrows logo replacing his BR crest. He would have been renumbered again while in this livery to 08168. Diesel was retired from BR stock in 1988 and entered private ownership with ABB Transport in York, where he was repainted back into BR green, maintaining his yellow and black wasp stripes. He later wound up in ownership of FM Rail in 2005 and was loaned to the Battlefield line. At this time, he returned to black, but still with his wasp stripes, and now sporting BR's lake crest. The lake crest on black is quite a rare combination. From 2008 to 2014, Diesel was loaned to the Bluebell Railway, and during this time returned to his original BR black with the early crest, now completing the original 08 look with the traditional red side rods. He was painted this way to better match the era of heritage rolling stock that he would be shunting there. As of today, Diesel now works under Nemesis Rail, and is again back in BR green with wasp stripes, but now with his lake crest on the sides of his battery boxes. In the TV series, Diesel eventually became a part of the Northwestern Railway, and his livery was not changed from his original crestless BR black. From season 6 onwards, his silver side rods became fully black, and this change carried over into the CGI series. Rusty. Rusty is the Skarloey Railway's first permanent diesel engine. Built by Ruffson and Hornsby, Rusty came to Sodor in 1957 to help rebuild the aging rails of the Skarloey Railway. Rusty is painted in an all-over black, with his name painted on him in yellow. This appears to be the railway's official diesel livery, and it can be assumed that the other diesel, Fred, also wears this, although we've never seen him. Rusty looks quite different in the TV series though. Instead of black, he was painted orange, with his name painted on him in white. It is a bit of a mystery why they chose orange of all colors, but if I had to guess, it's because his name is Rusty. Rust is usually orange in color, so they probably thought it fit him. It should not be forgotten though that the actual source of his name comes from his builders, Rustin and Hornsby. Smush those two together and you get Rusty. Rusty's real-life basis, the Tallyclin Railway's number 5, Midlander, has pretty consistently always worn varying shades of green its entire life, even following its extensive rebuild in 1980. As of today though, it is wearing black, so it can be posed as Rusty at the Tallyclin's Audrey Extravaganza events. I gotta say, it looks quite smart in black. Duncan. Duncan is the Skarloey's 6th engine, and arrived not too long after Rusty did. Duncan was built in 1928 in Scotland, and worked at an unknown factory before coming to Sodor. It's where he learned his rough manner of speaking from.
I'm a plain engine and believe in plain speaking. Speak up and stop whispering in corners.
We have no idea what this factory was, so the livery that Duncan wore there is, again, totally up to your own interpretation. When Duncan arrived on Sodor, he was painted in the Skarloey's standard red, with his name painted on the sides of his boiler, and he has worn this consistently since. In the TV series though, Duncan became yellow with gold lining. This was certainly a creative change. While the others' color changes had some precedent to them, yellow seems pretty out of nowhere. My guess is that they went with yellow simply to have all the main colors of the rainbow featured in the narrow gauge cast. I think it's pretty comical too, considering yellow is a color mostly associated with joy and bliss and optimism, and the railway's biggest grump wears it. How wonderfully ironic.
Bah, humbug.
The real-life Duncan, aka Douglas from the Tallyclin Railway, has worn a plethora of colors in his lifetime. It's worn multiple shades of green, red, black, and in current day, sports Royal Air Force Blue, this being in reference to the Air Force base the engine worked at before coming to the Tallyclin. Douglas has never worn yellow, though, as far as I know. I would love to see that happen someday. Donald and Douglas. Donald and Douglas are twin engines from Scotland. They are 652 class tender locomotives from the Caledonian Railway, and were the last two of the class built. First built at St. Rollock's Works in 1909, the pair would have been outshopped wearing the Caledonian's lined black livery. The first 17 engines of the nearly identical 812 class were painted in the much more known Caledonian blue, but as Donald and Douglas are of the 652 batch, they would have only ever received black. After grouping in 1923, the pair would have fallen under LMS ownership, and their smart lined black livery would have been replaced with the much less exciting unlined LMS black. At this time, their numbers would have been 17646 and 17647 respectively, and worn on their cab sides. Following nationalization in 1948, the pair would have been repainted again into unlined British Railways black with the early crest on their tenders. They were renumbered again, now to 57646 and 57647, respectively. This is technically the condition they would have been in when the pair arrived on Sodor in 1959. However, the illustrations show a couple differences. Instead of a number on their cab sides, there is no number, which, in fairness, is integral to the story, and red and white lining is there instead. Their tenders also have the same lining, complete with the early crest. Their livery here is a weird hybrid of the unlined and lined versions of BR Black. The 652s were never given lining under BR, so Donald and Douglas are rather unique here. During their trial on Sodor, their early crests were removed from their tenders and replaced with their temporary northwestern numbers, 9 and 10, respectively, so Charles Hatt could tell the two apart. After the twins had won Hatt over, he allowed them both to stay on Sodor, and gave them the option of what color they wanted to be painted in. They both chose blue, and I like to think that they wanted this color because they only ever wore black their whole lives before this. Donald and Douglas received the Northwestern Standard Blue livery in 1960, and I think it looks quite smart on them. In the TV series, Donald and Douglas were never repainted, and retained their hybrid BR Black liveries throughout the show. They also gained nameplates in this condition, which were fixed onto the sides of their smoke boxes. Daisy. Daisy, the diesel rail car, is a British Railways Class 101 DMU. She, however, is rather unique. The Class 101s were all multiple units, while Daisy was built specifically as a single car for Sodor. She was built in 1960, and like all the 101s at the time, was painted in British Railways Brunswick green with yellow lining. Unlike most diesels, DMUs were given BR's coaching stock roundel instead of the typical BR crests. Daisy, however, wears the standard early crest. As time went on though, it appears her crest was eventually removed. Like all of the big diesels in the Railway series, Daisy's face is a part of her bodywork, and so is painted over in the same color as her livery, making her one of the few diesel characters in the series with a green face. Wilbert Awdry's own model of Daisy differs from her appearance in the books. In the early 60s, British Railways started implementing yellow fronts onto their diesel locomotives to help people's visibility of them and increase their safety. It's a lot harder to miss a giant object coming towards you when it's bright yellow. And so, his own model of Daisy features her with yellow ends. She has never been depicted like this in any illustrations, but had she been, Daisy would have had a yellow face. It's also worth noting that Awdry's model also depicts Daisy with the accurate coaching roundel on her sides, instead of the early crest. The TV series depicted Daisy a little bit differently, giving her a gray face to be consistent with the rest of the characters. She wears a variation of BR's DMU livery, with the same yellow lining, but with a shade of green that is much brighter. She also lacks the coaching stock roundel on her sides. While Daisy's design was being worked out for her CGI debut, at one point the team considered giving her a nameplate on her front end, as revealed in some leaked concept art. This never moved past the design phase though, and Daisy's livery in CGI pretty much resembles her prop. Stepney. Aha! Another real-life locomotive. Stepney, everyone's favorite terrier. Stepney is one of the 50 A1 class tank engines built for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, designed to haul suburban commuter trains in the London area. These engines have a distinctive puffing sound that sounds like a dog barking, hence their nicknames, the Terriers. Stepney was first built at Brighton Works in 1875. Like all the Terriers, he was outshopped in the railway's brand new, improved engine green livery. You may have noticed that the color isn't actually green, it's more of a yellowy ochre. The theory goes that the Terrier's designer, William Stroudley, was colorblind and did not realize that the final color wasn't actually green at all. Other sources claim that he called it this because it was an improvement over the LBSCR's current green livery at the time, hence its title, Improved Engine Green. I'm not sure if we know which is actually the real answer, but I think the latter seems more plausible. Around 1903, Stepney was repainted, this time into the railway's new umber livery. In the early 1900s, all Terriers were rebuilt with larger boilers and smoke boxes. These rebuilt Terriers were classified as A1Xs. Stepney received his rebuild in 1912 and left the works still in umber, but now with LBSC on his side tanks instead of his name. After grouping in 1923, Stepney was renumbered and painted into the company's olive livery. In 1939, after another overhaul, Stepney returned to work again, but this time in the Southern's new bullied unlined green livery, the only Terrier to wear it. Nationalization occurred in 1948, and following this, all the surviving Terriers, all of which were over 70 years old at this point, were repainted again into British Railways unlined black, with the name on their tank sides. In 1956, Stepney returned from the works again, now looking much more smart, wearing the fully lined version of British Railways black, with the early crest on his tanks. This was his final livery that he'd carry until withdrawal, and he spent his final working days on the Hayling Island branch until 1960. But we all know that Stepney's story did not end there. Saved from the cutter's torch by volunteers, Stepney was preserved by the Bluebell Railway in Sussex. During the first 1960 season on Bluebell Metals, Stepney was painted in a simple lined black with his name Stepney printed on his tanks. The first time that he wore his name since 1912. He wore this livery again in 2010. But after his first season, Stepney was repainted back into his original improved engine green livery, a livery that he had not worn since nearly the turn of the century. He appears in the Railway series and in the TV series in this condition. It's undoubtedly his most recognizable look. He is still currently wearing this livery today, complete with a face. Shout out to Terrier55 Stepney for his complete history of Stepney video. It was very helpful in compiling all of Stepney's liveries for this. Thank you, Max. Bill and Ben. Bill and Ben are a pair of mischievous twin engines. They work for the Sodor China Clay Company. The two are based on a pair of saddle tanks unlike any other out there, the abnormally squat Alfred and Judy. These two engines were designed by Bagnall for English China clays, and had to be short in height to clear a very low bridge that crossed the Clayworks line to the port. Bill and Ben are not meant to be Alfred and Judy. They only share the same design as them. Their histories confirm that they went straight from Bagnall to Sodor when built in 1948, and have worked the Sodor China Clays line to Brendam ever since. Bill and Ben wear the Sodor China Clays yellow livery with red lining, with nameplates on their saddle tanks. Their livery is probably the best example of an industrial engine livery in the series. The two are painted in bright colors, something quite common with industrial engines. Many industrials had bright colors and design accents like wasp stripes to make them harder to miss in working spaces where people would often be crossing tracks. Industrials typically had their company's name written on them, sometimes as an acronym. In this case, Bill and Ben have SCC painted on their saddle tanks, which of course stands for Sodor China Clay. When the pair returned in season 17, they had a slight makeover, now gaining bright red wheels instead of their previous black ones. This is a change that I can get behind, honestly, because most industrials also had bright-colored wheels. It makes them stand out a little bit more. In the Season 17 episode, Bill or Ben, Bill and Ben are temporarily painted in an alternate dark blue livery with orange lining. An attempt from Topham to keep the two distinct from each other that failed miserably.
I like the new colour, Ben. It really suits you. Suits you too, Bill.
What's interesting about this is that Timothy, the apparent third engine at the clay pits who we meet later on in the series, also wears a dark blue livery very similar to this. It's not exactly the same, the lining color is different, but they're pretty dang close. Almost too close to seem like a coincidence. While probably not intentional by the show team, I always like to think that the blue was the clay company's modern livery, and that all three were meant to wear it together. Though for one reason or another, it did not stick on Bill and Ben, and they returned to yellow. Boco. Boco is, indeed, a real engine. But, like Toby, that real engine is not around anymore. At least, not in real life. But he still exists in our hearts. Boco is D5702, which was a British Railways Class 28 Cobo diesel, first built in 1958. Like most of BR's early diesels, the Class 28s were painted in BR Brunswick green all over. His vents were gray, and he had a gray stripe at the bottom of his body. As the same case with Daisy, Boco was given yellow ends around 1962, and this is the condition that he was in when he ventured to Sodor in 1965. Strangely, the height of the yellow panels varies depending on the illustration. Sometimes it covers his face entirely, and sometimes it stops halfway up his face and ends under his eyes. Several large diesels in the series wear this same livery. Bear wears it in the books, Derek wears it in the TV series, and Class 40 wears it in both. In 1965, British Railways had taken the steps to modernize their look. They shortened their name to British Rail and brought out what they called their new Rail Blue corporate livery with yellow ends, complete with the new British Rail double arrows logo. While Boco himself never wore it, one of his brothers, 5701, did, and it was the only Class 28 to wear Rail Blue with full yellow ends. 5701 does appear in the Railway series very briefly in the background of this illustration from Escape. We have seen several other diesels in Rail Blue across the series, including D199 and Bear when they first arrived. As we discussed earlier, Diesel also would have worn this livery at some point in his life. In the TV series, Boco is depicted in a take on the earlier version of BR Green without the yellow ends. He is fully green. However, the shade of green he uses is a lot brighter, and the livery is simplified. His vents are also all green, and he has no gray stripe. Interestingly, he retains his BR crest though, being one of the few engines in the TV series to actually wear it. Flying Scotsman. The big man himself, Flying Scotsman, one of the world's most famous steam locomotives. Flying Scotsman is the only remaining survivor of Sir Nigel Gresley's A3 class Pacifics. He was the first engine on record to go 100 miles per hour and was named after the LNER's premier service, the Flying Scotsman. He is also Gordon's younger brother. Flying Scotsman, like Gordon, was first built as an A1 class. He was outshopped in 1923 under the ownership of the newly formed London and North Eastern Railway. He was painted in the railway's apple green livery, at this point sporting an 8-wheel Great Northern tender. In 1928, he was given a new type of tender with a corridor built into it, so the engine crews could easily access the engine from the train. This was the condition that Scotsman was in when he famously went 100 miles per hour in 1934. During World War II, Flying Scotsman, along with many of the LNER's engines, was repainted into a wartime black, with NE on its tender. During this time, the LNER adopted a new numbering system, and his 4472 was changed to 103. After the war ended, Scotsman went back to Doncaster for a rebuild, It left the works in 1947, now as an A3, which meant it carried a new boiler and a larger banjo-shaped dome. He returned to his traditional apple green, but still wearing the number 103. This condition was short-lived though. Nationalization occurred only a year later, and in 1949 all the A3s were repainted into British Railway's new Express Blue livery, a livery designated only for the most powerful locos of the system. This was the only time that Scotsman ever wore blue. His number changed again, now becoming 60103. BR Blue was quickly phased out though, and in 1953 Scotsman was repainted again, this time into BR's standard Brunswick green with orange lining. In the late 50s, Scotsman was rebuilt again with a double chimney, and gained the lake crest on his tender sides. His final design change occurred in 1961, when all the A3s were given German-style smoke deflectors. This was the condition he was in when withdrawn in 1962. Flying Scotsman was very fortunately preserved though, and was back converted to use a single chimney. In preservation, he pretty quickly returned back to his traditional apple green, and also carried a second tender for a while in the 60s. And this was the condition he was in when he visited Sodor in Enterprising Engines. Since then, he's gone back and forth between his LNER and BR guises, and even once sported his wartime black when he returned to Steam in 2016. He is currently in his BR guise. It'll probably never happen since Scotsman in green is so iconic, but I think it would be so cool to see him painted in BR blue again, a color he has not worn in over 70 years. In the TV series, Flying Scotsman appears as a mishmash of all his most famous forms into one. He is depicted in LNER apple green, though the shade is notably darker, and this was likely done to visually differentiate him from Henry. He does have his second tender here, as he did in Enterprising Engines, and he wears his smoke deflectors, as the real engine in real life has currently.
Good luck, little brother.
Something I want to draw attention to is the shapes of the lining on his tenders. They have these weird bevels in the top corners, which bears resemblance to his Hornby model from the Thomas line. That, in turn, was lifted from the even earlier Ursel diecast of Scotsman, which reused Gordon's body and tender, hence the tender bevels. Why this was applied to his CGI model, I have no idea. But it's really funny how a repaint of Gordon in the Ertl toy line influenced the Hornby model, which then presumably influenced the official CGI model. I hate it. I can't unsee it every time I look at CGI Scotsman now. Oliver. Oliver is a 4800, later 1400, class auto tank from the Great Western Railway. First built in 1934, he is actually one of the younger steam engines in the series. The first livery that the auto tanks wore was the unlined Brunswick green with the full Great Western lettering on the side tanks, and this would have been applied to the ones built in 1932 and 1933 or so. 1934, however, was also the year that the Great Western shirt button emblem was introduced. As Oliver was built in 1934, things get a little confusing here. According to BR database, numbers 4830 onwards were built in 1934. As the current belief is that Oliver is 4853, he likely wouldn't have worn it. However, Audrey's own model of Oliver depicts him in this livery. So, for the sake of this video, let's just say he got it when first outshopped. But not long after that though, Oliver would have been repainted into the simplified livery, with the shirt button emblem on his side tanks. During World War II, Oliver likely would have been painted solid black, complete with GWR lettering on his side tanks. After the war, he would have received green again, and kept his GWR. In 1946, the 4800 class was reclassified to the 1400 class, and Oliver's number would have became 1453. After nationalization occurred in 1948, Oliver would have been repainted in either black or green, with British Railways painted on his side tanks. This did not last long though, as later that year he would have received full unlined BR black, with the early crest. In 1957 he received his final livery under BR, full-lined green with the early crest. This is the livery that Oliver was depicted in when he made his famous escape from the West Country to Sodor. He never received the late crest. Upon arrival to Sodor, Oliver was repainted into Great Western colors again, sporting his original shirt button emblem and a 1400 class number plate, a combination that never occurred prior. The TV series took some liberties with Oliver's livery. He is painted in a much brighter green like Duck is, and still sports his shirt button emblem on his side tanks. His number plate was replaced with an 11 painted on his cab sides, and his wheels became green. Quite a mishmash of designs all morphed into one with Oliver here, yet somehow he wears it pretty well. Once again, big shout out to Sodor Island Models for his research video on Oliver. That helped quite a lot here. And with that, we'll move on to some TV exclusive characters now. First up is Salty. I love Salty. Salty is Brendam Docks' resident shunting diesel. He's a British Railways Class 07 diesel shunter, all which were designed to work at Southampton Docks. And what's most interesting about Salty in particular is that he wears the number 2991, a number of an actual Class 07 that is still around today. Salty is, indeed, a real engine. So let's take a look at 2991's livery history. All 14 of the 07s were built in 1962 by Ruston and Hornsby, and were outshopped in BR's green livery, complete with yellow and black wasp stripes on each end, and red side rods. Interestingly, they all wore the BR coaching stock roundel instead of the more traditional late crest. Coincidentally, there's an episode where Salty recalls once being painted green. However, the context has nothing to do with BR, and it was tied to the island of Sodor having a shortage of red paint, so he was temporarily painted green.
But then, no one could find me, because they were all still a-looking for a red engine.
In the late 60s, BR brought out its new rail blue livery, and all the 07s were repainted in it, receiving the new double arrow logo on their cab sides, and yellow side rods. The 07s were withdrawn in 1973, and some went off into industrial use. 2991 fortunately survived into preservation. It's actually still in service today at Eastleigh Works as an active shunter, wearing rail blue and its TOPS number 07007. That's not the case with Salty though. At some point, Salty went to Sodor and was repainted into a red livery with pink chevrons and yellow buffer beams. I'm pretty sure that the livery is just fictional. However, there is a preserved Ruston with a strikingly similar livery, number 466618 on the Avon Valley Railway. I don't think that there's any connection between it and Salty, but the similarities are hard to deny. Emily. Emily is a beautiful Stirling single from the Great Northern Railway. We don't know much about her backstory, but as a Stirling single, we know that she must have been built at Doncaster in the late 1800s. All the Stirling singles were outshopped in the Great Northern's apple green livery, so Emily would have received this when first built. Now the singles received several modifications over their working lives. The cab shape changed, some gained domes, etc. But they all essentially wore the same apple green livery until withdrawal. The last working single was withdrawn in 1916, so the 50 or so years between then and Emily arriving on Sodor is a big ol' question mark. Regardless, when she arrived on Sodor, Emily was repainted into her more recognizable emerald green. Its design shares some similarities to the Great Northern livery. It has the same exposed brass and red-brown frames, but her apple green became a more darker emerald, her lining more yellow than white, and she gained rectangles on her tender. Emily never received a major livery change as the show went on, but she did gain a number in the final season. In season 24's Emily to the Rescue, she proved herself a hero and was awarded with a yellow 12 on her tender sides. It was long overdue. but finally she was recognized as one of the Northwestern family. Arthur. Arthur is an interesting one, because he kind of is and kind of isn't based on a specific locomotive. Arthur is a LMS Class 2MT prairie tank, based loosely on the preserved number 41241 of the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. We know this because Arthur's concept art depicts him wearing that number on his bunker. So, for the sake of this video, let's take a look through 41241's livery history. 41241, while being an LMS design, wasn't built until after nationalization in 1949. It was outshopped from crew, wearing the very smartly lined BR Black with the early crest. And this is the only livery it wore during its entire working life. It never received the late crest, at least not until preservation. 41241 was preserved by the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway in 1967, and it steamed to Keighley under its own power, as can be seen here, still bearing the now very faded early crest on its side tanks. Once arrived, the engine was painted in a special red livery, with KWVR on its sides. It has worn BR Black since then, including the late crest that it never got in service, but as of today, it is back in its famous red. Arthur, however, did not go to Keighley. He instead went to Sodor. When he arrived, Arthur was painted in LMS's Crimson Lake livery, complete with LMS on his side tanks. This is a livery that many of the LMS's passenger engines wore, though as Arthur was built in 1949, he never would have carried it. In the same way that I like to think that Donald and Douglas chose to wear blue because they never got to back in the day, I like to think the same for Arthur. He wanted Crimson Lake as he never got the chance to wear it because he was built too late. In fact, going by 41241's history, he never got a chance to be repainted, ever. Spencer. Spencer is one of my favorite characters from the TV series. He is one of Sir Nigel Gresley's famous A4 class Pacifics from the London and North Eastern Railway, a brother to Mallard, the fastest steam locomotive in the world, and a cousin to Gordon and Flying Scotsman. The show has never revealed Spencer's true identity. He was always meant to be a sort of representation of all the A4s into one character.
In fact, Spencer still holds the world land speed record for steam locomotives.
But considering that Spencer wears the A4's silver livery, let's just assume that he was one of the original silver ones built in 1935 for the sake of this video. First designed in 1935, 4 A4s were built specifically to haul the new Silver Jubilee train between London and Newcastle. These engines were designed as streamliners, with a wedge-like shape to cut through the air and increase their speed. They all had silver in their names, with a special silver livery to match. If Spencer was one of these, he would have been painted in all silver, with skirts over his wheels in dark gray, his name painted on the center of his boiler, and blue-shaded LNER lettering on his tender. The Silver Jubilee livery was short-lived though. More A4s were built to use across the LNER system, and they all wore the main garter blue livery exclusive to them, starting in 1936. The silver ones all eventually got this too. Spencer would have been painted in all blue, with his wheels in red. He'd also now wear a nameplate towards his front. This is the condition that Mallard was in when it broke the world speed record in 1938. During the war, all LNER engines received a simplified wartime black. The A4's wheel skirts were removed during this time to make maintenance easier. After the war, they were repainted back into their garter blue again, although they were never given back their wheel skirts. After nationalization, all of Britain's strongest engines were repainted into BR Express Blue. Spencer would have received this in 1949. One of the preserved A4s, Sir Nigel Gresley, currently wears this livery, and if I'm being honest, I think it's the best look on an A4. Once Express Blue was retired in 1952, the A4s all received the standard BR Brunswick Green with orange lining. In the late 50s, Spencer would receive one final livery change under BR, and that was swapping BR's early crest on the tender with the late one. This is the livery that all A4s wore when withdrawn. In the same way that Flying Scotsman is a blend of all his known conditions, Spencer appears to be as well. He does wear a variation of the original silver livery, however he does not have the shaded LNER lettering on his tender, and he wears a nameplate instead of his name being painted on the center of him. He also doesn't wear wheel skirts. Truly a mishmash of conditions rolled into one. But he pulls it off pretty damn well though, I gotta say. Spencer is quite the looker. As we get into the hit entertainment era of the TV series, and beyond, the new engine's liveries started to take on more creative liberties. We started to see less character designs inspired by real-life liveries, and more in bright colors, yellows, oranges, pinks, lime green, colors and designs that would make them pop on a toy shelf. However, there were a handful of characters that did take inspiration from the engines that they were based on, some even taking on the same numbers as their basis. Neville. Neville is... he exists. First introduced in Season 9, Neville is a bit of a peculiar engine. He is one of the Southern Railway's Q1 class tender engines designed by Oliver Bulleid, which have quite boxy shapes. Interestingly, Neville wears the number of a real Q1 on his cab sides, 33010, so we will use that to do our research for him. Like Toby and Boco, the real Neville is no longer with us. Originally numbered C10 under the Southern Railway, Neville was outshopped in 1942, wearing the very simple unlined Bulleid black. A fully black body with Southern on his tender and number on his cab sides, in the Southern's shaded sunshine font. After nationalization, Neville was renumbered and became 33010. His livery was altered slightly, now bearing the BR Early crest on his tender. And then at some point in the late 60s, Neville would have received the Lake crest, and this was the condition that he was withdrawn in 1964. In the TV series, the engine was not scrapped and found its way to Sodor. Upon arrival, Neville still wore his BR number, though for some reason had his crest removed from his tender. Neville actually works out pretty well timeline-wise in the TV series, and I've always found it interesting that such a random, real number was chosen for him. I wonder how that happened. Perhaps they used a photo from a book for reference, and 33010 was the one pictured. Who knows? It's Neville, though, and there is not too much more to say about him. Rosie. Rosie is an interesting engine to discuss here, because she is a rare example of a character receiving a major livery change in canon, and they actually stuck to it. Rosie is a United States Army Transportation Corps S-100 class tank engine. These American tank engines were specifically designed for use overseas during World War II, and many saw use in the UK during and after the war. As American engines, their crews often referred to them as Yank tanks. Rosie's backstory has never been alluded to whatsoever in the TV series. The poor girl didn't even get a proper debut story. She just sort of appeared one day. My own personal headcanon for the character is that she was one of the 14 Southern-owned ones that worked in Southampton alongside the E2 class tank engines, thus explaining why Rosie was so obsessed with Thomas when she first came to Sodor. But that's a headcanon, and we're just gonna stick with what we know for sure. Being a S-100 tank, Rosie would have worn some variation of the USA Transport Corps black livery when first built and entering service. The version of the livery would have depended on what works she was outshopped from. After that is the big question mark, as we don't know what she did after the war and before coming to Sodor. She could have went to Southampton, she could have went into industrial use, etc. This chunk of her backstory is totally up to your own interpretation. Regardless, once Rosie was on Sodor, she was given a pink livery with red wheels. This is the condition that she was in when we first met her, and she wore this livery for 10 seasons before receiving a change-up. After not really doing anything of note for a few years, Rosie returned to the show with a completely new look. As revealed by series producer Ian McHugh in an email to fellow Thomas tuber, the Thomas Theorist, He and Andrew Brenner always hated that Hit thought girls would only be into the pink train, and that it felt too stereotypical. So, they decided to overhaul the character. Blue and green liveries were considered, but they ultimately landed on red to put old James's nose out of joint for comedic story purposes. In Season 21, Rosie returned with a new red paint job, now with NWR on her side tanks. She also gained the number 37 on her cab sides, as she was the 37th standard gauge engine introduced into the series. She remained in this new livery till the end of the show. For someone who hasn't done a whole lot in the show, Rosie is quite a character worthy of discussion, and timeline-wise, she actually fits into the series quite well. Whiff. Whiff has been strangely relevant in several videos lately. I feel like I've thought and written about him more in the last few months than I have in his entire existence as a character. Whiff is based on Aerolite, the unique Class X1 tank engine from the Northeastern Railway, designed specifically to haul the Chief Mechanical Engineer's saloon coach. Only one of these engines exists in real life, and as Whiff and Aerolite both wear the same number, 66, it's pretty safe to assume that Whiff is Aerolite. So let's take a look at Aerolite's livery history. Aerolite is a weird case because the engine was built and rebuilt several times in its lifetime. The engine started out as a very primitive-looking 222 in 1869. I'm unsure what its livery in this condition would have been. I'm assuming green, but I could not find a confirmation of that. Aerolite was rebuilt for the first time in 1886, gaining side tanks and a new cab design. At this point, all of the Northeastern engines wore a Saxony green livery with thick Crimson Lake borders. The initials NER were worn on its side tanks. Aerolite was rebuilt again in 1892, this time into a 422. In this condition, it would have been painted in Northeastern green with black and white lining. Again, it continued to wear NER on its side tanks. In 1902, Aerolite was rebuilt one final time, this time into its more familiar 224 appearance. Its livery was again Northeastern green with black and white lining, but now Northeastern in full was painted on its tanks, complete with the Northeastern's emblem. An Aerolite nameplate was fitted below it. After grouping, Aerolite fell into LNER ownership, and it had one more livery change, this time into LNER Apple Green. It wore this livery until it was retired from service in 1933. When Aerolite was placed into the LNER's museum in York, it was repainted back into its previous Northeastern livery, and it still wears this look today. In the Thomas universe, Aerolite went to Sodor at some point and took on a new name, Whiff. He received another repaint, and it appears to be a toned-down version of the livery he was already wearing, with all the Northeastern references removed, but with the same black and white lining maintained. His green was toned down to a darker shade, although I suppose it is possible it's just a result of it being covered in soot and grime, so it just appears darker than it actually is. I've never actually realized before that Whiff's livery is essentially the same as Aerolite's. Amazing how different it looks when you remove all the fancy emblems and doodads from the side tanks. Victor. Victor is the resident engine of the Sodor Steamworks, and is basically the doctor character of the series, looking over all the other engines' well-being. He came from Cuba, and emigrated to Sodor at some point before we met him proper. Victor is based on a specific engine, number 1173, a rather squat, oil-burning saddle tank engine built by Baldwin for the Carlos Manuel de Cespedes sugar mill in Cuba. Victor wears the same number as 1173, and as both originated from Cuba, I think it's again safe to say they're meant to be the same engine, albeit very loosely this time, as 1173 is standard gauge, and Victor is narrow gauge. I don't know the full story behind 1173, but from what I've seen in photos of it in service, it wore black with a yellow stripe on its tanks. There have been variations from what I've been able to find, but all of them tend to keep the black with the yellow stripe. so I will assume that this was its main livery. In current day, it wears black with red side tanks and a silver smoke box. In the TV series, Victor's history differs a bit. In Blue Mountain Mystery, it's revealed that 1173 was sold at some point and traveled from Cuba to Sodor via ship. At this point in his life, Victor wore a yellow livery with green lining and 1173 painted on his capsides. He had an unfortunate accident on his first day, and the damage resulted in him needing a full restoration. The first word he learned in English was red, and so he chose that color to be painted in. Nowadays, Victor wears a dark red livery with yellow lining and wheels. Ryan. Ryan is one of the more recent characters to be featured in this video, and he's getting a mention here because he proudly wears his roots on his side tanks. GNR. Ryan is an N2 class tank engine from the Great Northern Railway, designed by Sir Nigel Gresley himself. Like Rosie, we don't have much to go off of in terms of a backstory for Ryan. He also just sort of showed up one day.
Branch line? I think that's where I'm meant to be working.
His number 1014 is of no help to us either, as it was not worn by any N2 in real life. However, he does wear GNR on his tanks, which suggests that he was one of the 60 examples built by the Great Northern Railway in 1920 and 1921, and is not one of the later LNER built ones. So, going off of this, we can assume that Ryan left Doncaster Works in the Great Northern's apple green livery with Indian red frames, just like Gordon and Emily did. He did not wear it for long though, as grouping occurred in 1923. Following this, he would have been repainted into the very tasteful LNER's black livery with red lining. Only one N2 received LNER apple green while in service, and that was number 9522. Both Hornby and Wren made models of it. As the only green one, it was apparently nicknamed the Green Goddess by its crew. During World War II, Ryan would have eventually received a simpler wartime black livery, with no lining and simplified LNER lettering on his tank sides. Nationalization occurred in 1948. Ryan would have temporarily carried plain black with British Railways on his side tanks, as many engines did. But as a passenger engine, Ryan would have pretty soon after that received BR's lined black livery with the early crest. He would have later ended his working life with BR carrying that same livery, but with the late crest instead on his tank sides. When Ryan came to Sodor, he was repainted into this special GNR-inspired purple with white and gold lining, and this is currently what he wears on the Northwestern Railway. As his concept art showed, the team considered a variety of liveries for Ryan, including blue, a muted forest green, and red, all with a dark red trim and a Ryan nameplate on the side tanks. Fisher-Price's choice of color was this one, cream with red accents. That's a interesting way to go, but they ultimately landed on purple with gold and white lining. This livery appears to be the GNR livery, just with the colors swapped. Not at all that dissimilar to Bluebell on the Bluebell Railway, which is technically an SECR green livery, just with the colors swapped. My personal choice would have been to just have Ryan return to his original Great Northern apple green. It's the best look on the N2s, at least in my opinion. But hey, the purple is nice too. And to keep this video at a somewhat reasonable length, we will finish off this whole thing with Merlin. I've always been so fascinated with Merlin. What an interesting basis choice for this character. Merlin is an N15 class tender locomotive from the London and South Western Railway, also known as the King Arthur class. He said as much.
The experimental prototype King Arthur class stealth engine.
He is meant to be a very specific member of the class though, number 783 Sir Gilmere, which was experimentally fitted with 3 chimneys during the war in 1940. This was in an attempt to spread out its smoke and hide its train from bombers overhead, essentially making it invisible. These extra chimneys were removed eventually, but in the Thomas universe, Merlin seems to have kept them. As Merlin is meant to be a real engine, it means he has a history that we can comb through. Merlin was one of the later King Arthur classes built under the Southern Railway in 1925. This means he would have entered service in the Southern's olive green livery, with Southern on his tender and number beneath it. He would not have had smoke deflectors then. However, he would have gained them the following year in 1926 when they were implemented on the whole class. They were the first steam engine class in Britain to have smoke deflectors, in fact. After 1938, the King Arthurs were repainted into the Southern's new malachite livery with yellow lining. His number would have moved to his cab sides. It and the Southern on his tender changed to the new sunshine shaded lettering. Merlin would have been in this livery when fitted with his 3 chimneys. As World War II went on, liveries were simplified for the ease of maintenance. If Merlin had gone in for an overhaul during, he would have been outshopped in wartime black, still with the sunshine lettering on his tender. Regardless, after the war, Merlin would have returned to his malachite in 1946 or so. Nationalization occurred and British Railways formed in 1948. And for the first 18 months or so under BR ownership, Merlin's Southern would have been replaced with British Railways in the sunshine font. His number also would have been changed to 30783 at this point. He was eventually totally repainted again into BR Brunswick with orange lining, with the early crest on his tender. At some point, Merlin's early crest was changed to a smaller one, and he was photographed with this in 1960. 30783 in real life was withdrawn in 1961, only a year later, so he likely never received the late crest. At some point after this, Merlin received his silver gray livery with red wheels, as he has in the TV series. As far as I'm aware, this isn't specifically based on anything. I think the gray is meant to tie into the whole Merlin the Wizard aspect of Merlin's character. Its lack of any painted detail makes it look like an unfinished undercoat or something. I mean, hey, for all we know, maybe it is. And Merlin was between liveries when we first met him. Of all of Merlin's liveries, the Southern Malachite is definitely my favorite of the bunch. Would have much rather seen him in this instead. For this pick of the week, well, it's a video that I've already mentioned. It's the complete history of Stepney the Bluebell engine by Max Davies, aka Terrier 55 Stepney. Not only was this video a huge help in listing out all the liveries that Stepney has worn in its life, it's also a fascinating look at the engine's life in general, and the overall working life of the Terriers. Stepney escaped the scrapper's torch a number of times. He was quite a lucky engine. Max's recent guide rail videos are very well put together, so I recommend subbing to him and checking those out too. Well, it's been a few weeks since the last video. If you missed my community post, the reason why is because I got a nasty case of bronchitis. I am feeling much better now. The worst is over, I think. But you can still kind of hear the gargliness in my voice a bit, and I still have that really annoying, lingering cough. I'm just happy to be back at work again. The next video will be a brand new collection video. However, it's going to be a little different from the last ones I've done. This will be covering a line of Thomas merch that is all new to me, so I think it's going to be pretty interesting. Keep an eye out for that. That should be out before the end of the month. Speaking of merchandise, can I briefly talk about how blown away I am by the recent reveals at Toy Fair? Mattel is indeed returning to the CGI series with all of their Thomas toy lines, and this all looks just so promising. The fact that Duck and Flying Scotsman are in that first wave of the new motorized line is absolutely insane to me. You just know that they're trying to appeal to diehard fans with this. I think some of the proportions of the engines are a little weird, especially on the tender engines, but nothing too crazy to deter me. The new diecast line looks wonderful too. It seems they're really going to lean into this being a collector line, complete with chase items in each wave. The chase item of the first wave here is a Railway Series Thomas, totally appropriate for the 80th. This is exactly the kind of thing that I have been wanting for years from Thomas. I am just so excited by all of this. Thomas's 80th is turning out to be quite an amazing year. Lastly, I want to shout out a fellow Gauge 1 modeler, Cam Jones, known as Gauge Cam on his socials. You may have seen his stuff before. He's the guy that built that beautiful Gauge 1 Skarloey in Tallyclin's current blue livery. He's built a ton of other characters and buildings, and he's now open for commissions. Only buildings and structures right now, all built using similar methods and materials used in the show for seasons 1 to 5. Check out his socials for more information. Links in the description. And that's about it from me. Got more videos on the way, so I will see you all then. Stay safe out there. Bye-bye.